So our first image, you see, it's a little simpler. It would be, considering perspective, pretty flat. And then we have number 2, which we have kind of a alleyway with some diagonal lines and a little bit of perspective, and also a little bit of extra light and shadow there. So the idea today is to bring these to life with, I have here my watercolors. These are my portable. These are the ones I would have with me when I'm on the run for traveling. So this would be it. And I also have with me my reliable mechanical pencil with HB lead. I'm going to use, and I like to introduce, you have so many different types of pens. So this is just it's a waterproof, and it's just an ink ballpoint pen. You can have fountain pens if you wish. The key would be to test it if it's water soluble or not. And we all know the microns. So I have lots of different gauges from 0.5, 0.3, 0.1 to 0.05. So I'll have these here by the side. And I'm planning to use lots of nice loose ink lines. Trying to create not a photograph, because we have the photograph right here. So the beauty of urban sketching is to do a quick sketch that is going to capture the feeling more than the actual photorealism of it. Now, I'm going to use my sketchbook. I'm going to flip it over because I'm going to do 2 quick sketches here. So what I would recommend is, number 1, I'm going to split this into 2 sections here, 2 small little sketches. And I do recommend spending a few minutes, maybe a 5-10 minute quick sketch before you get to work. Maybe it'll show you, ooh, I thought this one was a little harder, but it's actually the one I like better. And maybe you switch or change something in the composition, adding more emphasis to some of the elements. Remember, the elements are simple: line, color, shapes, patterns, light and shadow, obviously textures, or we could do tons of mixed media. So I'm looking at this image, number 1 here. I'm going to work on it on the side. So one thing, if I just sketch with pencil, well, we've all done that, but what if I showed you, because I'm going to be using color, I did not mention also color pencils. If you want to bring in color pencils, that's totally fine. But what if I were to use color first, then lines? So in this first example, I'm going to bring in a little bit of color, and I'm going to sketch away the biggest, simplest elements in my reference, and I'm going to try to make them not too well. We have the side of the street here, so I'm pretty much drawing. Let's lift this up here at the bottom. It's a little more carefree than what we usually do. Let's add a little bit. So I'm using just regular turquoise with a little bit of cobalt blue. And remember, you get to play with the color a little bit as well. I am working on a watercolor or a mixed media sketchbook, so that helps. And what I'm trying to do is just capture some of these big, and we have some linear, we have a little bit of curve here. So drawing with your brush, with looseness and a little bit of carefree approach, basically. And I'm going to have to let this dry, but you can already see, oh, look, we have what would be the fundamental elements of the image. And it actually seems pretty close. Yeah, well, we have other elements, and I can slow down just a little bit. Remember, this is just a thumbnail. Call it a preliminary sketch. Getting ready. So I'm going to lift some of this. Add maybe a few of the techniques that you love. And the other option would be, I'm going to switch to scene number 2, where, again, using pencil for sketching, or I'm going to just use this pen. And I mentioned these are just those regular, you find them at Office Depot, anywhere basically, type of ballpoint pen. And I'm going to try very quickly to capture the lines. Let me find my reference here, switch really quick. Oops, let's see where we put it. And again, just for a simple sketch, what I'm going to try to find first, and I'll have to go by my laptop here, finding whatever seems as I like to call it biggest, simplest, and most fundamental. Well, number 1 would be the ground floor here. And we are going to have a corner, which is right here at the edge. And then I really want to make sure I measure those angles. So I see one angle on this side. And one big clue is, notice how it reaches. It's not at the corner. It's a little bit higher. And it's not too much up to the middle here. But these are going to be the lines. And making sure when you work with perspective that you capture those angles. I like to use the markers on the page. So notice how here I have one end of the line. By looking at the angle, it points right to it. It's how far from the corner. And then trying to capture the angle. Same with the second line that I see here. It comes right about, and I know they're parallel, but they are going towards my vanishing point. So simple perspective. What happens to some of these diagonals? You could try and focus to capture all of the details as precise as possible. But remember, the idea is to have it free-flowing. Obviously, we are practicing a little bit of our drawing skills as usual. So incorporating a little bit of perspective could be intimidating. And here's where I would want to emphasize what would be the biggest element here. This nice arch with the little space around it. And then obviously that blue door. We have some columns here that seem to go up. So notice that the elements go from bigger to smaller, and also from a little bit simpler to more complex. And one last thing that I don't want to draw here, I'm going to use that when I bring in color, is going to be those lights and shadows. So all of the other elements, just mark making, and in a way, you begin to see how we recreate the scene. So here we had color first, here we had line first. Now for this one, I'm going to go right into my ultramarine blue, and we're going to add color. So we have these beautiful blue elements that just touch upon here, just a slight little touch of blue here. And one of the things you want to do when you do urban sketching, you want to squint a lot. If not a lot, often. And simplify the information, especially when you're working with light and shadow. So when you squint at this image, what is the biggest thing you see? Well, I see that sharp, and I'm going to add just a little bit of color here to this floor. And I want to make sure I see that diagonal light coming in. And also, using a little bit of the timing, making sure my technique, if I'm using watercolor, is dry enough so I don't have my colors bleeding in or mixing where they're not supposed to. So in a way, you see how sketching with line or sketching with color could be an easy way to start. start your drawing, I want to try and mix a little bit of this blue, and I'm using a little bit of phthalo blue, and I'm going to look for its complementary to neutralize it, because I just want a nice, interesting gray. So I'm going to add a little bit of orange, and I could make that orange a little redder or a little yellower, which would shift the temperature as well. We're going to make it a little bit redder, and then push it the opposite direction, where you could almost begin to see, as you add yellow, a little bit of green, and see if that matches these beautiful shadows. Now, what I want to do here is I want to make sure the other colors are dry, but already I see that it's just light enough, and we see that shadow coming in. Obviously, we see some of the light white of the wall, so we want to play with a little variation of value, lighter values of those colors. And it is somewhat dry here, but it's still really, it's a little moist still, where I wouldn't want to do that type of technique, bringing in so much wet. So I would actually bring out my hair dryer to actually try and dry it up a little bit. So while we wait for this to dry, actually it is dry. Let's go back to image 1. And here's one last thing I wanted to point out before we get started with your choice of image. All of these lines, I could begin to add a few lines. The way I do it, I recommend keeping your eyes on your reference longer than you keep your eyes on the paper. If you are not seeing it, that means you're making it up. So when you look, and there's going to be tons of lines here that you're going to see, you also get to edit. So for example, do I want to put this pole here? Why not? It's an interesting element. So I could do it with line, I could do it with color. But notice that my lines are not absolutely perfect. We have a nice little architectural element here, and it's a little lighter. So I'll come back and add more color to it. And then we have, I think, the biggest feature, which is coming up on this arch here. And again, the choice of using line or color to begin to create these little elements as highlights. But notice all of the stuff that's up here. Do I want to add all those wires and cables? And this is where you become an editor. And yes, we do have lots of little patterns. So that is where I would think about maybe bringing in color pencil, or going right back to watercolor once it's fully dry, and with the variation to the color, I could simply create some of those drawing patterns. Making sure I understand them first, and I do want to take my time to strategize and to see how can I best resolve the imagery that I see for my sketch. Notice we have one really interesting one here, which is the shadow. And that's pretty much what makes your urban sketching. It goes from good to great, is how you handle lights and shadows. Because that's, in a way, what creates the illusion. So whatever you do, and obviously the key word of the day, it would be pace. pacing yourself so you can actually work the technique, allowing yourself enough time to see which would be the best option. To create what you want to highlight about the thing that made you stop and look at this. So anyways, you begin to see how selecting the elements from biggest to smallest, and the other thing, very important thing that I wanted to show, which was the choice of color first or line first. And with the variations that we can create there. Now you could, again, bring in color pencils or just use watercolor all the way through. And that is what's going to make your sketches extremely unique. And reason why we would do this. So there they are. 2 examples, 2 quick thumbnails, 2 quick sketches. So I can get right into my final drawing. So my choice does not have to be the same as yours. If I choose color first or line first, you have to do it as you see, as you would feel more comfortable. Now I want to do this first one here is a little simpler, so I think it's the one I'm going to work. Although I like the light in the second one, this one here, I'm going to leave that as a challenge to you. Just so you see how it works. With the elements we're going to create, which could be a little more difficult, honestly, because it's a little flatter, so you have to put more emphasis into those details. So I can create my frame. You can create a nice little frame with tape. And I wonder if I am going to do that very, very quickly here, just to have a nice frame in the end. I'm going to use a little bit of this masking tape, make it a little bit thinner, because it's a little taller than it is wider. And for our sketchbook, it does look a little more professional, I guess. And I can also go all the way to the edges. So here we are. And right about here. I have to pull this down just a little bit all the way at the top. So this one's looking a little more square. I'm going to have to pull this one down just a little bit. I want that height. So I'm going to bring it down just a little more. Right about here. So there's my frame right at the edges. And now we get started with, I'm going to use pencil lines first. So the first thing I want to look at is, what is my closest, the foreground here? I want a little bit of ground. What I really encourage you to do today, check how often, what's the difference in the time that you're spending looking at the reference, looking at your paper. The more you look at your paper, the less you connect with your subject. You want to begin by analyzing and seeing some of the elements. So I'm putting this curve, which is right at the center, and then I'm sort of connecting some of these big fundamental structural elements, which are the sides. So yes, while I draw some of these lines, I do want to be looking at my paper, making sure that in a way they're not getting too dark. I'm just using these pencil lines as kind of guidelines. And I want to understand a little bit better how, overall, this shape that works itself into the next shape, so the frame of the door and the color of that cement, understanding a little bit of the material, and then without going too fast into those small architectural the features. So for example, here we have two little elements. That can wait. I want that bigger frame and the overall composition first to begin to make sense before I move forward. And this is going to say, well, do I have the composition, the size of it all like I want it? I kind of do. This here should be, actually it should be a little bit wider. So we will make that correction. And that's why you want to start big and simple. So you can change directions, make adjustments, not even corrections, adjustments as you see fit. So this one needs to be just a little less curved and a little wider at the top. And there's that number there. We'll add that later. And I'll break this shape into smaller shapes. All I'm looking for is angles, rectangles, squares, semicircles. And they will get more and more intricate. And that will be your choice to decide how far, how intricate do I really need these to be. I'm going to the side, and I have these interesting lining elements here that go pretty much straight across and to the other side. So when I move from line to shapes, now I'm beginning to see volumes. So some of these squares and rectangles are becoming more cube-like or box-like. And that's the beginning of a few of those diagonals and the beginning of adding perspective to my drawing, or juxtaposition, which means right about here, just a line. And one last thing, don't try to make it perfect. There is no such thing. Perfect lines, if it's not perfect, it's not straight, you want the opposite of it. You want unique, quirky, expressive, so almost looser. And I think I have all the structural things I need. I do have some lines that I may want to add here and there. Not every single one, but I'm going to break some of these pencil lines in here so they show up after I add that watercolor. And I think I may go with that decision. I could use a little bit of ink line first and then add my watercolor. So with this as my guideline, I'm going to bring in my micron pens, because you do want different gauge. You have thicker lines, thinner lines that show you different elements. So let's start with a 0.5 here. And I'm going to look for those thicker lines that begin to showcase some of those elements. And I'm wondering, where would they be? Because a lot of these lines could be created through my watercolor work. So adding some of these ink lines begin to make your drawing a little bit heavy. So you want to be careful with that. The moment you add too many ink lines, you have to consider, and I like to use the word heavy, it does get darker, it gets sharper, So the key would be continue reading, continue looking at your reference, and just really get the feeling of it. Get the lightness, the sharpness, the hardness, the transparency of it. Break the lines, use different types of lines. So here, for example, I have a line that does become a lot darker, and it will enhance the look of that shadow, since we have lots of shadow on this side. Now, I should mention, if you decided to go with a black and white drawing or urban sketching, making those choices obviously with line, it's going to be a little easier. You want it to be dark and heavy in that shadow area. Here we see a little bit of perspective. And then just a tiny bit of the side. So I was talking earlier about pace. How do you feel your way through, and what is the right pace that you should keep when drawing these lines? Some of you may be done already. Some of you may be just getting started. So only you know the true pace. Your lines will obviously show us that if you were maintaining the right pace. And pace means you could be more expressive. They could be more playful, more loose, really impressionistic almost. Like you only had 5 minutes and you wanted to capture it, that memory. So how would those lines look? Or if you have more time and you really want to be precise, what would be the pace for that? And finally, what are those features? Why? The question of why would I be drawing this door? Well, look at the way the shadow and these little elements, it's answering those questions that are going to make it even more fun. And for me, it has to be a combination of those things, color and how these elements. It's also a challenge. How will I decipher this? Am I going to use line and color first? How many of these lines do I really need to place here for it not to become heavy, overwhelming? So doing just a tiny bit of editing with the choice of what goes in, what stays out. A reminder, heavier ink lines where you see shadows. It's one of the easiest way to really begin to bring this to life. I'm saving this here, although I could use a little bit of extra line for watercolor. And I do want to take my time just a bit with it, as I will let it dry and create maybe a few layers. So maybe we're there. I think maybe, well, just a few more. As we continue here, we have smaller and more complex elements. So pace. It also means having pace and patience to know when to stop and switch your pen if that's what you need, or switch brush. Also patience and pace to know when you should let it dry before you make the next mark. Patience to maybe step back for a second and take it in. begin to break down the information and understand how all of these architectural features begin to make sense. Oh, look at that. They line up with this. And then there's one inside of that. And I'm trying to keep them light. See if I can actually enhance that with watercolor instead. But it's just, again, a little bit of sort of a soft guy line with ink pen. Just to get a sense if I'm in the right range. Right about here. And I think this, to me, would be one of my, this little area of the door, obviously, and this one here at the top would be where I would most likely emphasize my detailed work. Some of that color or line. With lots of looseness. And you begin to see the simplicity, the vision of, I guess, a designer or architect. And how it all comes together as you break it down. Okay, now I really think it's time for our first coat of color. So I'm going to go right back to that turquoise. I love this color. I maybe want to make it just a tiny bit bluer. And it's pretty easy. This is, I know there's areas where it's darker, but pretty much covers the entire surface of this door, where I could layer over it for some of those darker colors. So I don't have to be too careful. There's not a lot of light or white that I need to preserve here. I need to start thinking about technique here. Are there any areas where I will be using wet on wet or variations of the technique, watercolor techniques, where timing is crucial? This is just a wet on dry wash, sort of a first layer. And I'm kind of getting a sense of the color. Just a soft touch of cobalt here. And I'm going to mix in just a little bit of cerulean blue, just to see if it'll enhance a tiny bit. See, and as I just drop it in, now I'm using the technique of wet on wet to create just a little extra interest visually. That also matches the color a little bit better. And I begin to draw and break my stroke. There we go. So that begins to look quite interesting here. And as always, what are we here for? We're here to have fun, to lose yourself in this magical world of lines and mark making and watercolor, how it just can make you go to this place, transport you. Let's see. For this color, I may want to make it lighter. So there's a little bit of violet in it. I'm going to clean this up just a little bit. And I should I have an area, and I usually do this. I have an area down here where I could test my colors. So I'm going to test this cerulean blue, which is what I used for the door. And it made me, it's kind of close, but I also want to test this value of phthalo blue, and it's a red shade. And I think that's going to be it. That's a little bit closer to what I hope for, I want. Yeah, I think that's it. And I'm going to somewhat plan the wet on wet, but I do want this to have that look of automatic, which only watercolor can really do. So how long am I looking at my reference here? Almost the entire time. I want to emulate some of the markings. And I know I'm working with color, but it's still drawing. And I do really want to time this one as it goes from wet to moist. And as it stays in moist right before it goes to damp, I'm going to want to add markings. It's the only way I could really draw them or capture those patterns or textures that I have on there. Make some of these just a touch darker. And you see how it's still too wet. Let's go ahead and move this around just a little bit. Lift it up a little, because there's also some white in this pattern. Some of it, as I mentioned earlier, linear. It could be done better with color pencil. And let's bring that down here to, again, another pattern where I most definitely will use watercolor techniques to scratch and do a little bit of dry brush for those white patterns. Do a little bit of lifting. I'm using a paper towel here, but you could use all sorts of different tissue paper, brush, a dry brush. And I'm going to bring in a little extra water. So clean water, and I'm going to drop it in there just to lighten this up. Break some of that regular pattern there, and I'm going to want this to be more square in the end. So there we have it. And I could work with that a little bit better. So it's coming along. Let's go to a little bit of gray. I'm going to use a little bit of ivory black. And I'm going to touch it up with just a tiny bit of yellow ochre or sepia. And make that very, very light in terms of value. I'm going to add that down here. Just enough, making sure it doesn't, you don't want this to bleed into colors that are still wet. That's why I went all the way down, making sure this is fully dry. And if you want to work some of those patterns, I'm going to make that just a little tiny bit darker later on. Now there's an area here where I want to revisit right away, as I was saying, before it gets too dry, and that is here. And draw in just a little bit of that pattern with the shadow. And it may take a little while for this to dry, but you could begin to see how that's going to work really, really well. We have a little extra ink here with that shadow that I was trying to create. So this, if you're at this stage, you really want to make sure you're using the right brush if you're doing this with watercolor. You also want to make sure the right consistency meaning your watercolor is not as light or runny. Adding a little extra contrast with color, in this case the shade of the color, but also the consistency of it, hinting at, well, there's an area that is just a little darker. I'm going to add just dots of this, which will then become a little more specific when I add line. And I may do that with color pencil, as I've been saying, because you could do that here. Sometimes right here it begins to get a little risky. And then bring some of that in here. So I'm going for some of those bigger shapes. And as you can see, some of those bigger, darker shapes is what I'm trying to get first. So those shadows make sense. And it almost comes to the point where, yeah, well, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much done deal. Well, we want to take this just a little bit further. But as a sketch, I like where it's going. I'm going to let that dry just a little bit. There's a little more work that I could do as this also dries. I'm going to bring in more black at that top edge. And I also want to bring in a little extra, let's see if we have it here, just a little extra shadow right at the bottom of this step here. Now this may be pushing it. Maybe there's no need for this. But it also should work up here. And a little bit right here. Kind of tying it all together in terms of light. And I am missing just a touch of, what color would that be? Well, I have a buff titanium. Buff titanium. You could actually warm up this color just a tiny bit. But you want it lighter than darker for some of this part of the wall. Adding just a little extra volume. And notice no patterns on it really. I'm going to bring in just a little bit of it right in here, connecting this a little bit lighter, more water. Very carefully. There's still lots of wet areas that could really make this go in another complete other direction. Let's add some of it up here as well. Hinting at, well, there's more where that came from, up at the top, repeating the pattern. Now this got really dry on me. So do I need more ink lines? I could probably use some ink lines in here that will make it look better. And the other thing I want to show you is, can I also use color pencils? So here's my collection of color pencils. I have a few blues in this. And I'm going to start with a lighter version. And obviously this will have to be fully dry. It doesn't really work on wet surfaces, but I'm going to add some pencil lines here. Very thin, very light. And that is going to be my finishing touch for this area. as you get more and more creative. Notice we use pencil, ink, watercolor, and now color pencil. There's a danger to going a little too far with this. Too many. Is there? With mixed media, is there a danger to it? Let me go ahead and switch this blue to one that's a little more ultramarine. And I'm going to try to make some of these markings that I see on, and they're circular, like they're mismatched. I do see some of those pencil lines that I added early on. And I'm glad I did because they are there. And it helps the overall look of it. I'm doing this, once again, almost blind drawing. What does that mean? I'm not looking at my paper. I'm looking, 99% of the time, I'm looking at the reference. And I'm trusting my hand. And if it goes a little bit off, whoops, okay, no, there's going to be no harm done. All of these markings, in a way, they're pretty abstract. Make sure I put my pencil down where it's supposed to be and then follow from there. So this really makes your drawings a lot richer. There's another one where I could bring in even more pencil. So some of these areas where, instead of ink line, like here, where there's softer shadows that are gray, I could just bring in pencil once again. Now the key is it has to be dry. And you see how it does automatically add shadow to it. We could do that up here as well. And I'm just waiting for this to dry a little bit more so I could push. And I wanted to test. Some of these will be absolutely stunning with ink. So let's continue adding more of these lines. I do like how they're there, but they're not really there. And the looseness, the way you really should feel right now is like a little kid, scribbling almost, abstracting all of that information, but not making it up, interpreting what you see. So, as always, most of these are exercises in observation. So the biggest thing you need to be doing is observing. Really picking out what's there. I'm going to use a little bit of hot air here to make sure this is fully dry. That'll do it. So here's what I want to do. So I have color pencil and I also have my ink pens. So I'm going to switch down to a smaller, a 03. And I want you to see. So areas like this right here, so this inner part, I could come back and add more lines. And I want to make sure it's the right kind of line. Is it too heavy? Is it too dark? Well, some of them have to be. But if I could switch that with some pencil line, and I'm going to do these down here. You see these little architectural elements. They would really go over the top if I were to use ink. But with a little bit of watercolor, in this case color pencil, and the right choice, I think I could use a little bit of watercolor here. And making sure that point is sharp. For thin, beautiful hair thin lines, that's really going to bring it out beautifully. And again, loosely, you don't want to overdo any of these. It's just, again, a matter of style. In terms of style, how close to perfection, and I do perfection in air quotes, because again, remember, it's just an interpretation of what you're seeing. So the photograph is there. How close to the photograph do you want to get? Although it'll never be there. It's a stylistic decision where you need to know, how far do I need to take this? So here's some ink lines. making this a little bit darker. And I need to make that choice. Is this too dark? Could it have been maybe black color pencil? And again, I go back into that drawing mode of blind contour drawing, breaking up the line, creating some of that shadow. And letting it be just a little more playful. And it's sort of drawing in a negative way. You're painting out that dark space behind the bars, but then the bars just pop up and appear. And all those little decorative elements, you notice how I am sort of rushing a bit, just a little bit, to get it finished. So obviously my pace is a little bit off. But I would say for a quick urban sketching of a beautiful door, here's what I meant earlier, adding ink lines to that shadow. I'm going to do it over that darker value shadow that I did. And then the same thing with some of the lines there, where you would see that. And we come to the end where it just comes down to, okay, what are my finishing touches? How far do I need to push this until... Because we could keep going and going and going and finding more and more elements, details within the details, textures. But the biggest, most important thing is not to overcook it. And sometimes just pause, take a step back, take a quick look at it from a distance, give it a few seconds, so you can make a little bit of, call them better decisions. And that's what it is. Making simple, better decisions. But in the end, a beautiful sketch. I hope you enjoyed it.